my generation, those who graduated in the mid 70s from the university, were denied the knowledge of their own history because the British curriculum that we got from the colonial days did not allow us to know about our history. I mean, my first degree is actually in pharmacy. I worked in hospital, but when we were in the university, we realized that a lot of what we ought to know we have been has been kept away from us, and that was the urge that actually pushed me to go back to the social sciences.
Welcome back to another episode of the Markfield Institute podcast. Today, we have with us Dr. Usman Bugaje. Dr. Usman Bugaje is an Islamic scholar, political activist, and civil society leader and thinker from Nigeria. Initially trained as a pharmacist, his postgraduate studies have included an MA in social sciences at the Institute of African and Asian Studies at the University of Khartoum, and a doctorate in intellectual history focusing on West Africa and the Tajdeed tradition in Bilad Sudan from the same institution. He served as special advisor on political affairs to the Nigerian Vice President, Alhaji Abubakar, and he's a long-standing distinguished visitor in African politics at Johns Hopkins. Very pleased to have you with us today, Dr. Bugaje. How are you?
I'm okay, and it's my pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Usman, you've written widely and you've got a long-standing experience of looking at Islam in Africa. Why don't we start off by just speaking a little about the history of Islam in Africa?
Okay. There is a lot to talk about, but let me start by saying that my generation, those who graduated in the mid 70s from the university, were denied the knowledge of their own history because the British curriculum that we got from the colonial days did not allow us to know about our history. I mean, my first degree is actually in pharmacy. I worked in hospital, but when we were in the university, we realized that a lot of what we ought to know we have been has been kept away from us, and that was the urge that actually pushed me to go back to the social sciences. So I'm saying this just to make the point that it is so important to realize that there has been this attempt. I would call it an attempt because it's not quite succeeding to keep us away from our history. Because our history, the more we read about it, the more powerful it is. And as you know, if you don't know your history, you don't know your identity, you don't know who you are, you can always be told who you are and you can believe whatever you are told who you are. And this, I think, was the strategy that, the British imperialists, I suppose the French did the same thing. Other European colonizing powers tried to do it all in their own different styles. Now, when you talk about the history of Africa or the history of Islam in Africa, the first thing I think to remember is the fact that Islam crossed to Africa first before it even went to Medina. Because the first hijrah was to Abyssinia, the Christian king that was famous for his fairness and equity. About 100 of the Sahaba went there. I mean, the story is fairly well known of what happened, but the point is, and I think this is a divine plan, it's not something that just came inadvertently. So there is a lot of sense in which Islam actually crossed, and the presence of Bilal among the Sahaba, I mean, ties up this, if you like, the origins of Islam or the nascent community is inextricably linked to Africa, and this might mean that Africa has a role to play, later, or it has actually played a role in history. So we start from there, and of course, after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, you know what happened. Some of the Sahaba went in different directions to be able to extend the message of Islam, because they have finished learning, so to speak. They have graduated. The demise of the Prophet ﷺ, itself was the kind of graduation. They have now acquired all they need to acquire, and they moved in different directions. But a group particularly went to Kairouan, which is in present-day Tunis, and they set up a school there. And it is that school in Kairouan that actually was that brought out a lot of the, or engineered, if that's the right word to use, the Muslim community in that part of Africa. Meaning, that school was a school where one person, Abdullah bin Yassin, from the Sanhaja tribe that is now located around Mauritania, went to that school to study. And when he was coming back, he brought in a teacher to help him establish a school, in that area. And it is that uh, process that generated eventually a movement that was very famous called the Almoravids in English or in the Western languages. But originally they were called Almorabitun, meaning those who are in ribat, those who are in constant vigilance, in defense, of their values, of their community, of their territory. So it is this Morabitin movement that actually split into two. One went slightly south into what was then called Ghana. This is talking about the 10th, 11th century. And the movement that went to Ghana, the movement, the part of the Almorabi that went south and, went to Ghana, was the one that spread and established Islam in Ghana. And Ghana gave birth to Mali Empire, which is largely in the present-day Mali. And after like 2 centuries again, Songhai picked up. So if you like, the 11th, 12th century up to 13th century was the period when Islam developed, in Ghana. And Ghana, as you know, of course, was famous for its gold. And there was a trans-Saharan trade between the people in the Mediterranean part of North Africa and the people in that sub-Saharan Africa, what they call the trans-Saharan trade routes. This has been done right from the Roman Empire. So there has been that trade going on. So it's not like, but Islam came through those trade routes. And Islam spread in all these areas, not with by the sword as some Western historians, try to, but through the natural process of communication through trade routes, and people got to know about it. Schools were established, scholars developed, and they started writing locally. So 11th, 12th, 13th century, that was the Ghanaian period. And that from mid-13th, 14th, it was basically the Mali Empire. And you may have come across the name of Mansa Musa.
One of the richest people to ever lived.
Yeah. I mean, he had so much gold that when he went to Hajj, he brought down the world price of gold, down. And of course, he brought in scholars, architects, and so many other people that developed Mali. And that unique architecture of the mosques in Mali and Songhai, were attributed to his own period.
I just wonder, I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned at the start of the interview, when you were studying at the University of Khartoum back in the 70s, the types of history that were being taught. It's interesting that when people have very stereotypical or problematic views regarding, the history of Africa, you think back to the way Africa was conceived during the time of Mansa Musa, and it was known as this land of gold, of wealth, of culture, of intellectualism. And was that quite different to what you were studying when you were at the University of Khartoum in terms of the syllabus?
No, my experience was in Nigeria.
Oh, in Nigeria.
By the time I went to Khartoum, I actually went to study that history.
I see.
So I'll come to that.
Okay.
But what is important is to give this overview
Yeah.
of the history of Islam in
Sure.
Africa. So it came to Ghana, 11th, 12th century, 13th, 14th. It built up this big empire of Mali. And when Mali was going down between the 14th, 15th, 16th century, it was the time of Songhai, which was even a bigger empire. Maybe not as famous, but you have the Askia Muhammad, who was one of the prominent rulers of that, and he did wonderful things also. But that Songhai extended until across what is called the Hausa land, which is the current northern part of Nigeria, and up to the Borno Empire, meaning they were like supervising until the end of the 16th century in 1591, when Songhai was invaded. So let me quickly go back to the Almoravitin in the 10th, 11th century. The northern branch is the one that went north of Morocco and crossed the Mediterranean and got into Spain and established what, the 500-year Muslim rule in Spain. Spain was known as the Andalus. And some of the major scholars like Qadi Iyad, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Rushd, there are two Ibn Rushd. There is a philosopher, there is who I think is the grandfather of the faqih, the one who wrote the famous I'm trying to remember the book now. It's a famous fiqh book. بداية المجتهد ونهاية المقتصد.
Ibn Rushd.
Yeah, Ibn Rushd. Yeah. So I mean, they built a whole civilization there, and Europe learned a lot. European kings would write, to the Khalifa in Cordoba, asking for chances for a scholarship for their children to study technical sciences in those schools so they can go back and build their own. These documentations are all there in the archives, and some of them have started to come out. So what is important is, so far from what I've said, is that yes, Islam crossed to Africa, but it was after the death of the Prophet that the Sahaba moved to Qayrawan, and from Qayrawan, a school was built, and that intellectual pot, so to speak, gave birth to many things, including the Almoravids that played a great role in establishing Islam in Ghana, and then moved to Mali, built this great empire, and then moved to Songhai and built this great empire until about 1591. And then the other part went to north of Morocco and then crossed the Mediterranean and got into Spain, and until I think 1492, when the Muslims were expelled because of the Crusades and so many others, they built 500 years of civilization. And it was the only civilization in Europe at that time, because that was the period of what's called the Dark Ages in Europe, when Europe was not, developed, and it was not basically barbarians and all manners of if you like, uncivilized, behavior. Now, that part of history needs to come out, and luckily the books and the thing are there, and I think researchers are doing a lot of work now. New books are coming out. We'll get to know more. But there's another aspect of that history that we should not also forget. When you Google the first university in the world, you would see that the first university in the world is the one which is currently in Fez in Morocco, called the Qarawiyyin University. And these are scholars of the Qayrawan that actually came down, as the Almoravids, even before the Almoravids actually, and established that mosque. It was a woman also Fatima Al-Fihri, who built that university. The university is still standing, and it was started in 859. And that's quite early. The second university in the world is the one in Azhar, built 970. And if you remember, it was the Fatimid regime at that time that built it up, and they built it in honor of Sayyidatuna Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the third university in the world is the one built in Timbuktu, which was in Mali, it became in Songhai, and Timbuktu, that of Timbuktu was in 989. Exactly.
So I was going to ask regarding Timbuktu specifically. Was Timbuktu set up by the Malian Empire or the Songhai Empire?
It was a city of learning already during the Mali
Empire.
Okay. And it had actually started as a kind of, it became famous during the Mali Empire, but it had already started as a school around a mosque.
So it was a city built up around a space of education.
Yeah. No, the city was there, but it sort of, it
developed.
It developed and became famous as it became the seat of learning, but it became famous more for many people during the Songhai Empire, when scholars like Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu and Ahmed Bagayogo, were the teachers. These are people who have written a lot of books. Of course, before them, books were also written by other scholars. And this was established as early as I said, 989. And it was again built by a woman, a Bambara businesswoman, who built that particular mosque. The fourth university in the world, if you go to Google, is the one that was established in Italy, in Florence, in 1088. Now you can see the gap, between and you can see that learning has been, one of the major instruments in the history of Islam in Africa, in developing ideas, books, and developing societies, boosting trade, and the rest of it. So Islam in Africa is basically an educational enterprise, an intellectual endeavor. And everything that it has produced has flowed from that knowledge that was, organized, spread, created by scholars. Scholars would come from different parts of the world, to study. So it's a unique kind of thing that that we need to understand, because it's Africa that actually gave so much to Europe, or if you like, so much to the world, of its own time, that really produce all the good things that you might be able to speak about today. In other words, whatever you see today, the chances are that their roots or their basis or whatever has been, you find it, from the scholarship that has developed, along with Islam in Africa.
No, thank you for that really insightful overview, Dr. Usman. Coming back to where we started that conversation, then you said you originally trained as a pharmacist in Nigeria, and you said that actually the curriculums, the histories that were being taught at that time were not reflective of some of the conversations that we've just had.
At all.
So what type of things were being taught?
We were taught about the history of Europeans in Africa, that Europeans actually discovered Africa, and they gave us the names they want to give us, even the name Nigeria. I mean, we had our names, right? But they created a colony called Nigeria. And they told us about the history of how Britain or Europeans conquered the Latin America. The history of Pizarro, the history of this. Of course, we studied the history of the kings of England and the queens of England and everything good and fantastic, about Europeans, the steam engine, the Isaac Newtons and all the rest, as if we, as Muslims in Africa, had contributed nothing to civilization. So that, of course, is dishonest, right? I mean, but then the whole enterprise of imperialism is a dishonest exercise. So it has to go with similar dishonesties to support what they're doing. And we discovered it by chance. I mean, and in terms of oral history, you hear about the names of Sheikh Usman bin Fodio, who created the Sokoto Caliphate. You hear about Askia Muhammad. You hear about Mansa Musa. But it's all in either oral historical songs or some kind of history. But you cannot make much of it because a lot of the details and these things were missing. And remember, these histories were all written in Arabic. And the schools established when imperialism, took root and they started colonizing us was in English. So we were far away removed from Arabic. And part of the reason why I went to Khartoum was because there I could learn Arabic. And it is this Arabic that will allow you access to the manuscripts, of history. For example, it's only after that we discovered that our scholars who established the Sokoto Caliphate, which is like 200 years ago now, about 100 years before the invasion of the British, to create the colony they called Nigeria, these scholars who established this big polities, and it's a big polity. I mean, the Sokoto Caliphate has taken over the whole of what is northern Nigeria today, parts of Cameroon, and then part of Burkina Faso, part of areas of even Mali. So you have a huge polity that was being run efficiently with prudence, over the last 100 years by the time the British came. Now, these people who established this had written over 300 books, just the three of them. Over 300 books, not just books on tafsir, on the Quran or on hadith. No, they have written books on governance. How do you establish government? What are the responsibilities? How do you establish a police institution to give security? The judiciary, and how the judiciary must be independent, and how the head of state, by whatever name you call him, they call their own the Sultan, and then the provinces were run by Umara Amir, which has been converted to mean the Emir in English. How these people relate to each other and how they function, and if there are problems. And they've written about science and technology, about economic development, specifically works on political economy, even on medicine. They have written. I am as a pharmacist. I've written a paper quoting about a dozen books that these scholars wrote on different aspects of medicine. Some on hemorrhoids, some on ophthalmology, some on preventive medicine, some on kidney issues, so many other things, and using local herbs on the treatment, and especially the interesting thing on preventive medicine. I don't think time will allow us to get into the details, but these papers are available. We can make them available or make references to people to look at them. So what is important is for us to say that we discovered our history, and we found that this was much richer than European history, and much more. Our societies were far more advanced at that particular time. But then turn of events took place, and we can discuss that later under a different context.
No, absolutely. But I think it's fascinating because it's an ongoing conversation, because while colonization is, physically not taking place at the moment, that recovery of of identity, of knowledge, of access to knowledge, is something that's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And I think, to hear about your experiences is really, really useful, because it's, as I said, it's something that actually we're still struggling with to a certain extent in terms of learning about history and thinking about sources and trying to construct
and building or constructing a new consciousness.
Yeah.
As a result of those recoveries and those discoveries.
And I think that that segues well into my next question for yourself in terms of, you, and again, you've written and spoken about this in terms of that new consciousness, in terms of, as Muslim thinkers, where do we go next? I mean, you've spoken about some of the attempts to navigate this split between, what's considered Western knowledge and Islamic knowledge in terms of the Islamization of knowledge. Maybe you could just speak to a bit about that. What are your thoughts about these? What is the Islamization of knowledge, and what are your thoughts on the Islamization of knowledge?
I salute the efforts of those who embarked on Islamization of knowledge, people like Al-Marhum Professor Ismail Farouqi, and followed by Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman and Ahmad Tutunji, Umar, Professor Umar Kasule, a lot of them. Some of them are very close friends. And I salute, their effort and the effort they've done, and they've translated a lot of books they've done. But I differ in my own approach, as you would see in my article. I feel Islamization of knowledge is a little too simplistic for the challenge we are facing. And I think you cannot Islamize what you don't have. You have to first generate that knowledge. My approach is basically to say, look, if you go back to the roots of all the sciences that are fascinating, including AI today, if you go back to the roots, algorithm, from the name, this is an Islamic, sciences, or science produced by Muslim scholars, if you like, because of Arabic was the language of scholarship, for many centuries, and therefore all these terms and explanations all use the Arabic language. So my approach would have been to say, look, why don't we do what our scholars in the first place did? And what did they do? They translated a lot of the knowledge that was available from China, from Europe, from all these philosophical writings like you had in the seminar, were translated from the Greek. They did not go directly from the Greek to Europe. No, it was the Muslims who picked them up, translated them, digested them, critiqued them, and then did a synthesis. It is this work done by Muslim scholars that eventually got to the West, and West discovered the Greek through Muslim scholars, and therefore so that work that was done in the first place is what we're supposed to be doing. And what is it? Take what you have, right? Digest it, and then create knowledge. Now, in the creation of knowledge, it is there that you can then do it within a framework of Islam. And the framework of Islam is basically a framework that is fair and just, because another name for Islam is fairness and justice and equity and harmony. Essentially, when you reduce everything to what it is, you come back to this. It's not about prioritizing Muslims over non-Muslims, or prioritizing something. No, it's about achieving fairness, harmony, equity, tranquility. This is basically what Islam seeks to do. I mean, from the name, from all the things that we read about. Of course, those who don't read about it, those who don't understand it, or those who take or mistake the behavior of some Muslims that are themselves ignorant about Islam, to be Islam, come up with these wrong views about Islam. And all we need to tell them is that be patient, read about it from its original sources, look at the Quran, which has now been translated in almost every language in the world. If I say every language in the world, I mean majority of the, the bigger languages, French, Spanish, Chinese, Taiwanese, Swahili, whatever language.
I think we've even got a Latin Quran now as well.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah,
Which is
yeah.
excellent. That's the original Latin, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's good. So the point is, on this subject, my approach would have been we should work harder. And in doing this, there are certain things that still remain to be done because life is always is about overcoming or providing solutions to the challenges. Let's look at one of major challenges today, for example, is environment. Now, there are principles of environment within the Quran, within the Hadith. Now, instead of Islamizing the environmental sciences that we have, we digest what is available, but we go back to the source and then take our bearings from there and now use whatever knowledge is there and complement it, supersede it if we can, with the knowledge, or on that trajectory of Islam, and then produce a new knowledge that then will have the Islamic stamp on it. I would rather do that than just simply pick something that has been produced out of a context, a different context, and then try to. I thought that's a more difficult work to do, and it's oversimplification in my own view. But like I said, I know these people mean very well, and they want to do something that is good. So I have no doubt in my mind that they will get their reward for what they are doing. But I think it's important that they think through and they try to review and try to do more. And I think some of them have started realizing how simplistic the idea of Islamization and the way it started earlier is, and that there is need now to do more work. We have to go back to what they call the drawing board and pick our bearings from where they are, and then use that to develop a trajectory, and then to move, with all the force that we can. When I speak of force here, I'm speaking about an intellectual force. I'm not speaking about physical force. I better explain that so that somebody doesn't think that we're going to fight someone. No. So this is I think the way to go. And I did say in that article about 30 years ago that it is a matter of prioritization within the Muslim world. We have the resources to build laboratories, to build universities, to build industries. We have what it takes to do so, but we are not doing so. We are using the wealth that God has given us lavishly without prioritizing knowledge. And therefore, we just simply throw away the money, in frivolities. And that was my concern, that Europe is where it is today, or the West is where it is in terms of technology, because they have prioritized knowledge. And who is even more entitled to prioritize knowledge more than a Muslim? Because the first 5 words that came in the Quran was not to worship, was not to pray or to do. No, the first 5 words was basically on knowledge. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. These were the first 5 verses. And that speaks volumes of what we as Muslims should be doing. Knowledge should be our priority. Knowledge is so important to us. Without knowledge, you can't worship. Without knowledge, you can't practice Islam. Without knowledge, you cannot protect yourself, right? As a community. Without knowledge, you cannot do anything. You will not be anything. And therefore, the resources that Muslims have, and this is what I thought really we should endeavor to do, is to urge Muslim governments or Muslim authorities or Muslim communities to prioritize knowledge. And when Islam speaks about knowledge, it's not just speaking about the knowledge of the Quran or the knowledge of the Hadith. Yes, these are important because they are fundamental, but that's not where, or the knowledge of fiqh. No, Islam talks about the knowledge of society, the knowledge of science and technology, the knowledge of religions, the knowledge. Nothing is left out. Anything that is there to be known, is considered as knowledge. But of course, in Islam, knowledge comes with responsibility. It is not just something so you can do it any way. Like I remember one of our teachers was telling us, he was speaking in the context of science and arts, and I think if I remember correctly, he was saying that science can tell you what you can do and what you cannot do. But philosophy, under which we have ethics, is what can tell you what you should do and what you should not do. So what I meant to say is that when we come to discharge our responsibility, then we should be ethical. We should be mindful of what is it that will be useful and what is it that can be harmful. We avoid what is going to be harmful and we go for what is going to be useful.
So look, on that point, I think you raised a really important and significant question regarding knowledge, especially when we think about the way we encounter knowledge today. I mean, taking from your point regarding Muslims in the pre-modern world, of course they were studying Quran, of course they were studying Hadith, fiqh, theology, but also all of these other sciences were considered part of that heritage. We think about Imam Ghazali and something like we were teaching about Munqidh min ad-Dalal, which is, quintessentially a book about psychology. Ibn Khaldun and his Muqaddimah, arguably a book on sociology. As you mentioned,
and philosophy of history.
And philosophy of history, exactly that. Ibn Sina's Al-Qanun fi Tib. This was a canon for medicine, and all of this was Islamic knowledge. And so I think using that as a blueprint, as you said, rather than superficially grafting ideas from the West or other civilizations, going back to that tradition and using that as a basis to think about the future is certainly something that I think we should, as you mentioned so eloquently, something we need to be considering, especially because we face so many challenges currently. And one of the challenges that we face, as you mentioned, throughout the interview is that of epistemology. On that point then, could you potentially speak a little bit more about the research that you did on intellectual history at the University of Khartoum, the notion of tajdeed and its role in developing Islamic thought?
Well, let me start with epistemology. For me, epistemology is everything. It's broadly called the theory of knowledge, but the key thing is what epistemology teaches you, or what it it teaches you, but it also gives you the capacity it empowers you to be able to differentiate knowledge from opinion. It's not everything that people write becomes knowledge. It's not everything that people say becomes knowledge. Knowledge has to, or information, or whatever opinion, has to pass through certain processes before it becomes knowledge. And it is this technique of, if you like, processing ideas, knowledge, information, and one of the major things that has, if you like, that is important in getting or understanding epistemology is that there are two basically broad classes of epistemology. You have an epistemology because every epistemology is predicated on an ontology. Ontology is the hierarchy of being, that in the pyramid of being. You have at the top for Islamic epistemology and even Christian epistemology, you have God sitting at the top of that pyramid. And then after him, you have prophets, you have learned people, and then it comes down until you get to the bottom of the pyramid where the wider society is. Meaning that you look up to the higher authority to verify what you are, or when it comes from higher authority, it gives you the legitimacy to now say this is it. Now, what happened during the Enlightenment in Europe, and that has since dominated Western epistemology, is the argument about whether God exists at all. And this, if you remember, was promoted by scholars like Nietzsche, who actually declared God dead in one of his lectures. And a number of scholars went along with him. And so they created an epistemology where instead of God, this is the second type of epistemology, you have man sitting there. This is the essence of enlightenment, and that's why they call it the age of reason. The time when reason, from man alone is enough to verify things. And so these two epistemologies will keep clashing because of the different ontologies on which they are predicated. And sometimes they cannot even communicate because this epistemology does not recognize any higher authority above man. While the other epistemology, while giving man the role to use his reason, is not stopping man from using his reason. In fact, the Islamic epistemology in particular keeps reminding man, that you have to reflect. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا تَتَذَكَّرُونَ أَفَلَا تَتَدَبَّرُونَ. Meaning, you have to keep thinking, reflecting, deep thoughts. So while that is allowed, but there is a kind of framework which has come from a knowledge that is beyond the knowledge of man. And all this is basically to help man navigate the world that he did not create. And is coming from the creator of the world in which man lives, the sustainer of the world in which man lives. So these two different epistemologies keep, if you like, crashing or keep in some kind of conflict. But it's easier for those who have got an ontology with God sitting to understand those who do not have that kind of ontology, where man is the ultimate in thinking. Because it's something that if you don't have if you don't have a God in your life, it's difficult for you to think of one or to behave like one. And of course, if you engage people who think God does not exist, there is a limit to which they can go. I mean, you teach theology, so I'm sure you are quite familiar with this kind of argument. So coming back to basically the challenges that we're facing today, I would say the first is the epistemological challenge, where these two epistemologies are concurrent, engaging, but not understanding each other. And it's time for us to begin an engagement where it's not to convince people with the man-centered epistemology to drop their ideas, but we can engage them in which we can show them the limitations, or even if they do not accept these as limitations, they see the difference. So there are areas where we can work together. There are areas where we have to go our separate ways. And Islam at least accommodates, all these views. Of course, the only time when Islam will step out and stop is when there is going to be harm on the society. For example, Islam has stepped out to say, no, you can't use, you can't take usury. Because if you take usury, which is, you might say, interest in the way the banking system is, you're going to create poverty. And this is exactly what is happening. And we can now say, and if you remember the financial crisis that took place about a decade or two ago, and a repeat of it that came a few years back, you can see this truth becoming uh, 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 visible very clearly. And now a number of people have started realizing, yes, this is this thing really creates a lot of problems, and therefore they are moving away from it. And this is why non-interest banking, if you like, don't call it Islamic banking, but non-interest banking is spreading. And many countries in Europe that I know have adopted it or have allowed a window of that. And they could not have done so without realizing, you know. I remember Gordon Brown one time. I don't know whether he was the prime minister then or he was the chancellor of the exchequer. But I knew when there was a crisis, he had to go to Dubai and engage with those in Islamic banking. And he came back quite happy and ready to allow Britain to give licenses for this because he saw the sense and he saw the ways in which that has become far more humane and therefore more sustainable and therefore more a peaceful kind of society that are built. And there were some scholars who wrote a book here called Spirit Level. You remember that book? Came out about 20 years ago.
I'm not sure about
Spirit Level is something that you need to read
Okay.
because it talks about how this kind of economy that we run, creates inequality and how inequalities create conflict and how conflict makes human society unsustainable. And they did run some tests and some research to show that the less the inequality in society, the more stable, the happier, everything goes right, and everything we're looking for is actually there.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I think one of the resolutions of the United Nations, and I recall when I was in Parliament, I was part of those who prepare some of the resolutions about, inequality. Is hammering on inequalities and talking about that the more unequal societies become, the more the conflict that's going to be in that society. And what's the purpose of life, or rather, what is there in life if you cannot have the peace to enjoy whatever you think you have? So it's important we realize that in one of the major challenges we have, the roots are epistemological. So we need to get these epistemologists to start talking to each other. I don't see it as what do you call it, as a clash of civilization. I mean, Huntington's book has been criticized by his fellow Westerners, and he has been shown to be wrong in even in some of the facts that he used to do that. So I would rather say that the major challenge that we have is one, that these epistemologists are not talking to each other. They are in some kind of conflict and we need to engage. But also, we need to realize that the world in which we live today, it requires complementarity, not competition. And I saw a clip from a Chinese recently that seems to symbolize the kind of thing. And he said something that might be important on this respect. I'm paraphrasing him. I'm not using the words he used, but I'm trying to. He said basically that China in the last 30, 40 years has grown to the size where it is now a world power, recognized in terms of economy, in terms of defense, in terms of so many things, right? Then he said, well, the worry of the West, especially America, is that China is going to rise and dominate. He said, no, China is not going to dominate anybody. He said that the 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 the, the phase in world development of domination is actually gone. No country, no economy, no nation, no power can dominate anybody now. It is complementarity. And that is the message of Islam. You know, a wife complements her husband. A husband complements the wife. A husband is incomplete without a wife. A wife is incomplete without the husband. And in nature, complementarity is the whole. And you find the oxygen you breathe is produced because of the carbon dioxide you exit feeds a particular part. So there is a circle of complementarities that sustains the world. The same with economy, the same with society, the same with every other thing that makes the world really run, efficiently. So I think this complementarity can only come when we get the epistemologists to speak to each other, to be able to see that in this engagement, we can identify the deficiencies and we can see how we can complement these deficiencies so there'll be efficiency, so there'll be harmony, so that there'll be sustainability.
No, I think that's, I mean, the point is that everything runs back to epistemology, as you mentioned, in terms of how we produce knowledge. And it's absolutely the case that, a critical engagement with that question is probably the root of how we take on some of these contemporary challenges. Let me pick you up on that point you raised then, because you mentioned China. And you said, China, I mean, the rise of China in the last 3 or 4 decades has been exponential. We're at a point now where, potentially China is, of course, a world power, and it's grown in a relatively short period of time. Speaking about the Muslim world, perhaps speaking directly about Nigeria, where you've been involved in politics, how does Nigeria become the next China, or how do we see growth in that same way? Because we've seen it can be done. I just your
Well, let me
thoughts.
start with population growth. The United Nations projections are that in 2030, which is like 6 years from now, Nigeria will be 300 million in population. In 2050, which is barely 25 years from now, Nigeria is expected to be about 420 or 430 million in population. That will make Nigeria the third largest country in the world after India and China. So if you plan it now, is the time to plan for some 25 years. So Nigeria, in terms of population, and that reflects the population in Africa. Of course, it's the most populous nation in Africa, but Africa itself, I think, is expected to be like close to 1/4 of the world population in 2050. So what I think it's about 1.8 now, so it's expected to be about 2.6 when the world population is going to be hovering around 10 plus or 11 or thereabouts. So the population growth is the driver of the economy, is the driver of the conflict. It depends upon how you manage the population. In Nigeria, we have Nigeria has been blessed with enough resources. Now, resources basically don't help you much. If anything, they make you rest on your oars and they inhibit your thinking. I give an example of a country which, just as we're talking about China in 30 years, 40 years, grew from the bottom to the top. It's not much talked about, but is one of the most fascinating transformations. South Korea. South Korea in the 60s was discovered after the Korean Civil War that split the country into North Korea and South Korea. South Korea in the 60s was declared the second poorest country in the world at that time. South Korea is largely hilly, maybe about 20%. of the landmass of the country is flat enough to have any agricultural activity. South Korea hasn't got oil, it hasn't got iron, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have that. And when the army got tired of the politicians and General Mark expelled the politicians and took over, he changed the orientation of the country. If you like, he changed the epistemology, right? The way of looking at things. And from that time on, they started, even from the river Seoul, where the capital is, they were generating about 10,000 megawatts, of electricity, which is more than twice what Nigeria is able to generate at the moment. And that's not the real transformation, meaning just see how much. But they started a steel industry. Yes, America was helping them because the North Korea was socialist, Russian inclined, so they were supporting the Western inclined South. But when they wanted to do a steel industry, Americans did not want to invest because they say, how are you going to, you don't have steel, you don't have iron ore. So how do you, it was Japan that actually saw sense in what they were doing, and they helped them with the investment. And Korea became the second largest exporter of steel in the world. What I'm saying is that resources don't help you very much. I mean, Japan itself, look at what it did after the Second World War. And look at where it is. It rose, from nothing to the cutting edge of technology. And it's because they decided to just go technical. They don't have the huge population. They don't have the resources that the Arab world had, like oil and all this. And so they say, hey, wait a minute, what can we do in this world? They realize, yes, this is the way to go. And they were able to flood the whole world with their Toyota, And since then, they have not turned back, and they are still perhaps leading in terms of automobile technology. So I wish Nigeria didn't have some of the things it had now, because perhaps we will think better. but anyway, we have population, which is a huge advantage. That's why I started with that. But then population is like what they call the two-edged sword, right? You can use it, because population, if nothing else, is a market, gives you a market. So if you start production, you already have your market. You don't have to go anywhere. But also, if you don't manage population, it can be a catastrophe. Like a few countries that that have gone down, that have not been able to lift themselves up. So in Nigeria, we have got this potential, or if you like, advantages. The problem is, how do we use these advantages to build the country? Now, this is the job of politicians, but you can only do that if you have a vision. If you have no vision, you are given money, you just simply spend the whole thing without any use, without any impact. You just go on shopping spree, frivolities, and this is what politicians do. They build big houses, they buy expensive vehicles that they don't really need, and they buy houses in Dubai, in London, in Paris, in some places that they rarely go to. And this is how they just fright away the money. And this is basically what we're doing now. So what is the problem with our political system? Many problems. But essentially, the problem is that our leadership recruitment mechanism is faulty. Because it's like when you calibrate, something, it only produces based on that calibration, the product it produces. So the leadership recruitment has been calibrated, or if you like, it has not been calibrated, and because of that, it has been hijacked, by the pedestrians. And these are the people now who are basically in politics. A lot of the people we have in politics are crooks. They are people of very little education. They have no vision. And therefore, just primitive accumulation is their target. They get to the office, they steal the money, they put it in their account, they hide it here, they buy this and do that. And it's crazy. It's like sickness. And because of this, the whole country is grounded. There are no good roads. There is no infrastructure, electricity in particular. You cannot speak about the internet because you don't have some of the most basic things. And therefore, it cannot compete with other countries in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, they say knowledge is the greatest capital. Our universities, our secondary schools, our primary schools are in shambles. When we went to school, primary schools in the 50s, they were some of the best primary schools. We went to our secondary schools, we could compete with secondary schools in Britain here. We went to the universities. By the time we graduate, we get automatic admission into postgraduate in Western universities. 30, 40 years down the line, where basically all these institutions have been.
Instead of progression, there's been regression.
No, it's more than reduction, it's destruction. Actually, that has taken place. Now, one of the major challenges we have now is how do we salvage our country? There aren't many people thinking about that, but there are. And it is the burden of those of us who think about this salvage mission to try to see how can we wrest the control of the leadership recruitment process from these pedestrians to be able to actually inject people with vision, people with the resources are there. I mean, if you want to fix this country, a term of 4 years is good enough for you to change the trajectory of the country. There are 3 things that I said we always can do, and once we do them, we basically can put this country back to shape. The first thing to do is to fix the economy. How do you fix the economy? We have agriculture. The land is favorable for agriculture. All you need to do is to stop exporting raw materials. So you do what they call fixing the value chains of the major products that you produce. And that means processing. And once you do this, you create jobs. That comes with prosperity. The value of what you export is going to be more. And therefore, the dollars you are going to get, the foreign currency you're going to get will now boost, your earnings, at the international level. And then you do what they call import substitution. You stop importing. You try to produce the things that you are importing yourself. In 2014, for example, Nigeria was the largest importer of tomato paste. Can you imagine that? This is a country that can be the largest exporter of tomato paste. And I keep talking about agriculture because at the moment there is a huge problem of tomatoes right now as we're speaking in Nigeria. Before this thing was produced in large quantities, it will rot away, and it was like one of the cheapest things you can get. Yet today, it is so expensive that it's beyond even the middle class. Now,
tomatoes.
Yeah, tomatoes, just ordinary tomatoes. And what is our production? The average production per hectare in Nigeria is about 5 to 6 metric tons per hectare. I'm sure something has happened, we are doing less now. But until this crisis, it was 5 to 6. The African average is 20 metric tons per hectare. So you can see we are just about a quarter of the African average. But there is a country in the Caribbean, Cuba, that is using technology and is producing 120 metric tons per hectare. There is a South-South cooperation, framework where people from Nigeria can go to Cuba, tuition-free, learn these techniques, come back, implement them, and boost their production. Because our politicians are either daft or they are they don't have the presence of mind. We have spoken to them not once, not twice, not 3 times. Their mind is not there. They will spend the money in just one foolish trip somewhere. So it's not that they don't have the money to do that. It's not that they don't have the graduates of agriculture, who have got the potential to go to Cuba, and they don't have to spend even 2 years or 3 years in Cuba. 6 months will be enough for them to do this. So you can see in just one example of a tomato what we can actually do if we change the leadership. So our greatest challenge is, how do we change the leadership recruitment process? And of course, we are making efforts. We have tried some few things. They are not working. We are still working. I think we will never give up. If this process does not work, we'll try other processes until we're able to change that epistemological, outlook, until we're able to change the process of leadership recruitment and begin to get people with education, with vision, with commitment, with the courage to be able to, at the moment, anybody who finishes a secondary school can become even the president of the country. There are no criteria, really, that you can say constitutionally you'll hold someone to. Or even within the parties, there is no criteria within the party that says that you have to have character, you have to have competence, you have to have courage, or you don't have anything. It's just cash and carry, kind of. And this is the problem. And as you know, we are deep into insecurity. We are deep into the corruption. All these are matters that have to be addressed for Nigeria to come out of the abyss.
So as we come to the end of the interview, I suppose one of the key things that you have mentioned, and perhaps speaks to this current malaise in which we find ourselves, is that of, firstly, education, reinvigorating the educational system. But number two, it's not just about education. You spoke about this at the beginning. Education for what purpose, right? That notion of ilm, that notion of, real knowledge, or and linked to that is the idea of vision. But all of that comes back to that question of epistemology. Where are we taking knowledge from? What are we? For what purpose are we creating knowledge for? Also, and we can potentially finish where we began, and that becomes the key thing of investing in our institutions to produce knowledge that is useful.
It comes with an ethical component, which now builds a character. It is that character that's going to give you the leadership that you require for so many things to be fixed.
Dr. Usman Bugaje, thank you so much for your time.
It's my great pleasure.